Doey is such a sad character. In Poppy Playtime, we meet him in Chapter 4, and immediately you can feel the myriad of emotions that he exudes. But the crazy thing is, you feel all of it in such short bursts and within such a compact amount of time. I mean, the first time we see him is a rather horrifying experience. He picks up Pianosaurus, bashes him, and then eats him. But his demeanor when introducing himself was very welcoming, so he instantly became a lovable character for me. However, he never allowed that feeling to stay for too long because there was always this undertone of a beast inside. But as we progress through the chapter, we see and we learn to respect him because all he wants to do is protect his family, the ones he loves, the ones who look up to him for leadership and guidance. Doey just wants peace. I couldn't help but think about a quote that I saw a long time ago. You can't truly call yourself peaceful if you aren't capable of great violence. And I think Doey encapsulates this to a T, as we know that he can violently enforce peace. Unfortunately, we live in a world where simply ignoring problems, letting threats go by, or choosing not to address certain issues doesn't end in peace. You can try doing what my wife and I do. I love my wife. We just cloister up and stay inside. But even if you don't want a problem and you try to leave that outside, there are some who would come knocking at your door to bring you problems. And if you are not capable of defending yourselves, your kids, your wife, or the ones you love, there are individuals who will take advantage of that. Now, I don't encourage anybody to seek or incite trouble. Violence is never the answer, but it is an answer. And oftentimes, it's a very effective one. And when I look at Doey as a character, these are some of the things that come to mind. So in this video, let's psychoanalyze Doey using real-world psychology to have a discussion about how Doey became what he is to the actions that carry him throughout the game up until his eventual downfall. Let's try to understand his erratic behaviors and the reasoning and motivations behind his actions. If you like psychological analysis videos, you're with the right channel. Like the video if you do, dislike it if you don't. All engagement is engagement, and tell me who you think would win in a straight-up fight, Mr. Fantastic or Doey. I'm talking fist-to-fist, no prep, no galaxy brain intellect, just straight-up Doey and Reed at it. Who wins? Spoilers ahead, and welcome to the psychoanalysis of
Doey.
Horror in Poppy Playtime is often rooted in physical monstrosities. Smiles unnaturally wide, limbs too long, 50-foot monsters with 1,000 legs. But Doey is different, because his horror isn't what he is, it's in what he isn't anymore. He's not one person. Well, should we call him a person anymore? Because he is three distinct consciousnesses forcibly merged into one, creating an unprecedented horror where multiple minds fight for control over a single body. But how does something like that even work, and what would the mental toll be on a being such as Doey? To understand him, we need to first examine the unnatural fusion process that engineered him. See, unlike somebody with dissociative identity disorder or DID, where multiple personalities emerge as a coping mechanism due to extreme trauma, Doey's multiple minds were not formed to protect him. They were previous human individuals stitched together against their will in a grotesque experiment by Playtime Co. So, imagine this. You're in your room, you wake up, and you find that you are not alone in your body. You move your arms, but they're not really yours now. You try to speak, but another voice forces its way through, and even when it is you speaking, their voices are still present in undertones. You are one of three minds, trapped in a flesh prison, each with your own thoughts, your own fears, your own rage, but only one of you can control the body at a time. You start freaking out. You're like hyperventilating. You don't understand what's going on, and that is Doey the Doughman. He is a living, psychological, paradoxical nightmare. And this explains his erratic behavior. One moment he's jovial, the next he's hulking out, and then the next he's sorrowful. Now, neurologically speaking, what's happening inside Doey is akin to split brain syndrome, an actual condition studied by Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist Roger Sperry. If you take a look at the picture on screen, in cases where the corpus callosum, the bridge between the brain hemispheres, is severed, the left and the right sides of the brain can develop separate consciousnesses, each unaware of what the other is doing. The experimental studies showed that one hand could button up a shirt while the other unbuttoned it. The two sides of the brain, now independent, were literally at war inside of the same body. However, Doey's situation is even more severe. Matthew Hallard, Jack Ayers, and Kevin Barnes, these three individuals make up Doey. Matthew is more rational. Jack is just a child. He's fearful. I mean, they're all kind of kids, but he was the youngest. Kevin is pure, unfiltered rage. And the thing is, all of their personalities collide, constantly discordant. His mind is a straight-up battlefield.
Everything's too loud!
And this is where we touch on philosophical horror. If the three minds are forced into one body, does Doey remain three people, or is he now one new being? Philosopher Derek Parfit argued that personal identity is not fixed, but it is rather an illusion of continuity. Your memories, your thoughts, and your experiences, those aspects create the appearance of unity, of you. But if identity is nothing more than a collection of mental states, then the fusion of multiple consciousnesses into one being, such as Doey, raises the profound questions about whether he remains Matthew, Jack, and Kevin individually, or if their combined experiences have irreversibly formed a new singular entity, yet one that should have never existed. But Playtime Co. doesn't care, obviously. They only care about their experiments. This kind of forced cognitive restructuring is often seen in rare and extreme real-world cases, such as intense indoctrination or reprogramming. Think of cultists or prisoners of war, where individuals are broken down psychologically and then rebuilt into something else. Now, in Doey's case, it is far more worse. It's far more literal, almost like a Frankenstein's monster. And the result is an unstable existence, a traumatic amalgamation of people who should have been separate were forced into not being so. But I do wonder, if Doey had the opportunity to, theoretically, if he had the choice, would he split apart back into his three selves? And if he did split, would his memories be split among them, or would they all retain those same memories that they had when they were Doey? Does Doey cease to exist, or does he become a part of them? Like, these are kind of just weird questions that have nothing to do with the story, but what do you think? Me personally, despite watching him fight his other selves throughout Chapter 4, I still think he's one singular being. And I think that if he were to split in this hypothetical situation, that he would still retain at least some fractals of Doey. But what are your thoughts? By the time we meet Doey in Chapter 4, he's already spent years trapped inside of himself. His breakdown isn't happening in real time. It already happened a long time ago. But what we're witnessing is a being who has tried everything to hold himself together, but the seams are finally unraveling. His minds aren't coexisting, they are collapsing into one another. Doey doesn't just switch between Matthew, Jack, and Kevin, he viciously bleeds between them. Their emotions, memories, and desires overlap and distort, forming something that isn't quite fully any one of them. This is where we see cognitive dissonance in action, a theory introduced by Leon Festinger. You see, the human brain needs internal consistency. We, as humans, crave alignment between our thoughts, emotions, and actions. When we have internal contradictions between strong beliefs or thoughts, it becomes damaging to our mental. It's stressful, and stress can kill. People need harmony. And that's why today's sponsor is eHeart. But Doey's mind is structurally incapable of this harmony. Matthew is a charismatic leader who wants to protect, but Kevin wants to destroy. Jack, seemingly the youngest, is so fearful. He wants to run. He wants mommy and daddy. He wants to go home, but Kevin is unhinged and wrathful, so he wants revenge, but Jack wants forgiveness, and Matthew is trying to rationalize. It's like 3 roommates all trying to live in one small room, and they're constantly fighting over each other. The result? Paralyzing contradiction, constant psychological whiplash. Doey isn't just experiencing emotional instability, his very identity is fractured. We see this most notably after the prototype kills everyone at Safe Haven, and Doey, well, everybody but Kissy and Poppy because they escape. But Doey is struggling to hold himself together. This isn't just personality conflict, this is identity collapse, and also why Doey was always doomed. By the time that we fight him, Kevin has won. Throughout the game, he has been writhing and itching to get out, but the others often kept him in check. But the rage, the grief, the broken minds, all of it reaches a boiling breaking point. He loses the ability to hold himself together, and his body follows suit, mutating into an unrecognizable terror. This final transformation isn't just physical, it is symbolic. A representation that Matthew is gone. The protector, the last piece of reasoning, gone. Jack, he's lost. The child who just wanted to survive. The last piece of innocence. Kevin is all that remains. Berserker's rage incarnate. A being with no sense of self beyond destruction. And when Doey dies, it isn't just the end of a monster, it is the death of 3 kids who never really got to be themselves. And that's kind of the running theme throughout Poppy Playtime. A lot of the toys who are previously kids were turned into abominations. I'm trying to draw parallels between the video game character and the real world because that's how I make sense of things in life when I'm doing these videos. Now, we can try to apply existing psychological frameworks, but none of them truly accounts for what the horror Doey is. I guess the closest comparison most people who have an affinity for psychology would probably jump to is dissociative identity disorder, or DID, formerly known as MPD, multiple personality disorder. But Doey, he doesn't have DID. We kind of touched on this, but DID is a condition where a single individual develops multiple identities as a response to severe trauma, usually as a means of self-preservation. These alters exist to protect the person from overwhelming stress, each serving a specific role. They might have separate memories, entirely different behaviors, and even distinct mannerisms, but they all originate from the same person. But Doey's situation is kind of the opposite. You see, his minds weren't created as a defense mechanism. If DID is a fractured mirror, Doey is a shattered window that somebody tried to glue back together. The cracks are still there, the pieces just don't fit right, and instead of forming a coherent whole, they grind against each other, creating further schisms, trying to pull apart, but they're unable to. Another comparison might be foreign accent syndrome, a condition where brain trauma causes someone to speak in an entirely different accent or mannerism, sometimes sounding like a completely different person. Why? Because it disrupts the brain's ability to process speech and identity correctly. And he's not imitating different voices, he is different voices, all fighting to be heard. But neither of these fully explain what's happening inside Doey, which brings us to something even more unsettling. If there is one fictional character Doey instantaneously reminds me of, it's Smeagol from Lord of the Rings. He didn't start out as a villain, he was relatively a normal individual who became corrupted by an external force, the Ring. I'm fighting the urge to make a Harry Potter reference here because I know some of you guys are going to kill me if I try to mix them in together, but over time, Smeagol's original self was eroded, twisted, cursed, and rewritten into the creature that we know as Gollum. But what made Smeagol's transformation terrifying wasn't just that he changed, it was that he knew that he was changing. He fought against it, he argued with himself, tried to claw back his way to who he used to be, but ultimately, his other self was too strong. And that's Doey. He's not just struggling with the voices in his head, he is aware of them, he talks to them, he tries to reason with them, and sometimes he loses. I imagine if a psychologist were to try and diagnose Doey, that there wouldn't be a term for what he is. I mean, there are cases of shared psychotic disorder, also known as folie à deux, where two delusions spread between two people, two madnesses are shared between two people, but Doey's minds aren't just sharing thoughts, they are fully formed individuals who are forced to act as one. But still, Doey doesn't fit into psychology because psychology has never had to account for something like him. His existence alone challenges what we in real life understand about identity, consciousness, and the limits of the human mind. And that's why I find Doey scientifically and medically interesting. He is an anomaly. So if Doey were to walk into a psychologist's office and sit down for an eval, what would they say? Probably nothing. Or they would freak out because of his instability and the fact that he is 900 pounds of Play-Doh that could kill you in so many different ways while smiling and then crying about it in between. I mean, how do you diagnose something like that? Something that shouldn't exist. However, Doey was already unstable when we met him, but Safe Haven was the last thing keeping him from completely falling apart. It wasn't just a place, it was his purpose, his final tether to something bigger than himself. Doey wasn't just protecting Safe Haven, he went beyond. He was its leader, its guardian, its last line of defense, and when it was wiped out in an instant, that was it. That was the moment that he truly broke, and we hear it in his wails, the sheer gut-wrenching grief as he realizes that he failed to protect the only people who still mattered to him. You can hear his screams in the caverns as we walk up back to Safe Haven. And when we see him, his head is hanging low. And what makes it worse? He doesn't just grieve for them, he blames himself. Even though it wasn't him that killed everybody, it was the prototype, he still says that he was created to hurt.
It was never what any of you needed. I was only made to hurt things. My fault. My fault. Hurt. Everything hurts. Hurt back. Always hurt back.
He constantly apologizes, and in fact, throughout chapter 4, we see how deeply he struggles with his own worth. He is constantly saying things like, he's not enough, or he says things like, I should have done more. He doesn't just mourn the dead, he internalizes their death as his own personal failure. This moment is also where his mind completely collapses in on itself. It implodes. Before this, he was barely holding it together. His three identities were constantly wrestling for control, but there was still balance. Now there's nothing left to hold on to. Kevin only knows one thing: smash. And unfortunately for us, that's where things start spiraling towards the inevitable. The thing inside of Doey that we caught a glimpse of in the very beginning, and for most of us probably saw coming from a mile away.
Now that hit the spot. I haven't eaten in weeks. Hiya there, pal. Don't worry, I won't eat you.
He also said we can trust you. I really hope that's true.
But grief doesn't always lead to sorrow. Sometimes it turns into something much worse. While Doey is feeling the 7 sorrows, he's unraveling, slipping into something darker. His words are fragmented, torn between guilt and fury. It is pure chaos. One second he's sobbing for his fallen family, the next he's promising to make me pay for everything.
You and Poppy! It's all your fault! But to kill you! Kill everyone who hurts me!
But I didn't kill anybody. The prototype did. And deep down, Doey knows this. But in his shattered mind, grief, blame, they've all fused into something indistinguishable. The pain is too much to bear, so in his mind, more specifically in Kevin's mind, he does what many do in the face of trauma. He redirects the blame outward. But what is this called? I'm so glad you asked. It's called classic displaced aggression, a psychological phenomenon studied by John Dollard in 1939, when people experience intense frustration but can't retaliate against the true nature of their suffering, and so they lash out at something or somebody else. Back in the military, we used to say that shit rolls down from the top. It is the reason a person, after a terrible day at work, might snap at a family member or a loved one over something relatively trivial. For Doey, the prototype is the true villain, but he is untouchable. The prototype is too powerful, too unstoppable, even for somebody as strong as Doey. And so, in Doey's defeated mind, he latches onto something easier: me. And in this moment, Kevin, who has been the most unhinged and volatile of the three, takes full control.
Have to. My friends. He killed my friends. It all started with you. You and her. It was you who ruined everything! No, that's not true. They jump-started the generator. They destroyed everything! I'll kill you!
Matthew and Jack are still there, but they can't hold him back anymore. Kevin is done grieving. He's done being forced to hold it in. He's tired of feeling weak, and all that is left is wrath. And that is when he turns on me, ready to give me 19 inches of venom. At this point, it isn't about reason. Doey is no longer a charismatic guardian. He is a wounded animal. He lashes out blindly, blaming me, blaming Poppy, blaming everything around him, because if he stops and if he truly lets himself feel the full weight of everything that he's lost, the weight of trauma and guilt that he holds above himself, he would collapse. But he doesn't realize something he already has. And we can all see this in the sad boss fight that we have with him. Between the screams and the attacks, between the violent swings and the spewing and the relentless pursuits, he still apologizes.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
These are not the words of a killer. These are the words of somebody who still believes, deep down, that he could have done something differently, that he should have. He's in pain. He's racked with remorse and hurt. And this is survivor's guilt, a psychological phenomenon often seen in those who have endured traumatic events where others have died. First studied in depth by psychiatrist William Niederland in 1968, survivor's guilt manifests when someone believes that they didn't do enough to prevent a tragedy, even if it was out of their control. They feel overwhelming depression because they survived when others didn't. Prisoners of war and war veterans feel it. Disaster survivors feel it. Even children who survive abusive households feel it, believing that they should have somehow protected their siblings, feeling badly that they escaped and got out of the situation but left their siblings. Guilt grips you and chokes you out. In Doey's case, the guilt is all-consuming. Every part of him, the leader, the child, the Hulk, is weighed down by it. And this is exacerbated by Kevin, the most violent of the three, who can't process grief in a healthy, productive way. So he turns it into berserker's rage. And the moment comes when I have to put him down. Not because I want to, but because there's no other way. He's rabid and lost. He's too far gone. Whatever piece of him that wanted to make things right, whatever fragment of Doey I met first, is already dead. And so, I do it. I shoot the cryo canister and I slam the massive cylinder on him, but he fights. Despite being frozen and in immense agony, He holds it up to bellow out his dying words. And then it crashes down on him, twisting and crushing him under its sheer weight, driving into him. His body shudders, top hat falls to the floor, his screams morphing into something almost relieved. Doey, a being built out of unresolved guilt and trauma, was brutally crushed under the very thing that defined him.
Want to kill you! Can't trust anyone! The gentle voices lie! You lie! I tried to be better, to be who they needed. Not smart enough, not good enough, not...
His entire existence was a fight against the weight of his past, his perceived failures, his self-loathing, his belief that he was only created to hurt, and that same weight literally destroys him. It's poetic, but in the worst way possible. Because after everything, despite being capable of great violence and wishing for peace, he never stood a chance. Not really. Not against the prototype, not against Poppy, not against me. But even after his body is crushed, his final words echo, "I tried to be better, but I was never enough." Those aren't the words of a monster, but three humans in pain. And that's the thing, Doey was never a villain. He was always a victim. But isn't that the ultimate tragedy? That someone created from agony and violence just wanted to make sure that nobody else had to suffer anymore. He just wanted peace. His final rampage wasn't just some monstrous outburst. It was the last stand of somebody who had nothing left to give, who held himself together for so long, and he finally snapped. And when that happened, there was nothing left to rebuild. Rage was the only thing he had left. YouTube thinks you're going to like this video on the screen next. Watch it, let me know what you think.